everybody, and welcome to the third and final episode on my little mini-series on two-player board games. The first thing that I did was I had my discussion video about two-player exclusive games and Kickstarter, and just sort of where two-player games are going, what we've seen, and all that kind of stuff. Last week I did a top 10 video about my favorite two-player exclusive games. That is, games that are designed solely for two players. And now today I'm going to be doing the sort of other side of that particular coin, where I'm going to be talking about my top 10 favorite two-player games that are versatile in terms of the number of players that they can play and work reasonably well with all those numbers. That said, before I really get started, as always, if you haven't done so already, please take a look at my Facebook and my Twitter pages. That's where I post new videos, giveaways, contests, fun articles, all sorts of cool stuff, and it's another great way for you guys to interact with me. But that said, like I mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about versatile game numbers and two players. And so what you're going to see is primarily games where you don't need a lot of person-to-person interaction. That's one of the biggest issues with a lot of games that end up boiling down to two players, where you'll have economics or auctions or something along those lines, some like attacking and all that kind of stuff, where you really need to have more than two players to keep something really interesting. And so you're not going to be seeing a whole lot of that. I've got a few social games and stuff like that, so I'm really excited to talk about it, and as always, I'm mostly excited to hear what you guys have to say about this. This is a huge category, talking about just games in general that can be played with two or more or just different numbers of players. So I would love to hear what you guys have to say. As always, please put any and all thoughts into the comments below. But with that, we're going to go ahead and get started with my number 10. At number 10, I've got one of the games on this list that I do not own, and it actually has a pretty big caveat on it. It is Santorini. That's right, this is the one game that made both lists, and it's caveated for both of them because technically the game in the instructions says that it is designed for two players. It is made to be played with two players, but you can play it with three or four. I have played it with both three and four players, and essentially with the four-player game, then you are looking at essentially having two different teams, and then with a three-player, you really need to play with the god powers, because if you don't, then you end up with what I ended up with all the time, which was like a king-making scenario, unfortunately. But that said, we're talking about two players here, and the fact is that Santorini is a wonderful abstract two-player game. You've got a lot of really great strategy, you've got a lot of interesting abstract movement and stuff like that. Adding in the god powers adds an entirely new layer of strategy for not only how you're going to play as the player, but also how you're going to attempt to block your opponent and all that kind of stuff. But either way, Santorini, even though it's caveated, is once again my number 10. At number 9, I've got a game that I have talked about several times in this context. It's a really interesting and unique worker placement game that involves essentially a giant dial. The game itself is Tzolk'in, the Mayan calendar. Now in this game, when you play with two players, then you have to have sort of like dummy pieces that block certain spots on the worker placement wheels. And the thing is that I am totally okay with that. One of the biggest things with this game, with having multiple players, is that you want to have those spots blocked off. You want to reduce the number of options, and so you really do need to do that when you only have two players. And the thing is, I think that it works. There are some games where you play them and it just doesn't quite feel right. So, for example, with Seven Wonders, when you play with only two players, you have a dummy player that each person sort of switches off playing as, and it doesn't feel very organic. With this game, it feels much more organic. It still feels like the same sort of game as if you have two or if you have three or four players when you only have two. And I just think that it still balances out very well. It's still very interesting and very well done strategy, because by and large this game does not require a lot of interaction between and amongst the players, so you don't have to worry about it too much. But with all that, Tzolk'in is my number 9. I've got a fairly unique game that's almost a throwback to last week, where a lot of the games on that were different in the sense of you could have very distinct play styles depending on which side of the conflict you are on. In this particular case, we have the exact same thing. The game itself is Fury of Dracula. In this game, essentially, you have one person playing as Dracula and moving around in secret, and then everybody else is playing as the hunters trying to track down Dracula. And the sort of interesting thing with only 2 players is that you would have one person playing as Dracula and one person playing as all of the hunters. And for me at least, this ends up being actually a lot more efficient than it is with having upwards of 5 people. Because with 5 people, you essentially have Dracula and then you have 4 different people playing 4 different hunters. If you have a single person playing all of the hunters, it means that the hunter turns tend to go much more quickly and much more efficiently because you got one person planning it out for everything. Now, at the same time, you can have that situation when you have more players because you can end up with sort of like an alpha gamer thing, which is not good. Don't get me wrong, I don't want that. But at the same time, if I play with 2 players, I tend to have a little bit more fun just because it means that both players get to play more and more efficiently because Dracula does their thing and then the person playing as all of the hunters does all of their thing, and it just, it makes it a lot smoother, at least in my opinion and in my experiences. And so that's why I really like it. But again, just like with most of the games on this list, you don't really require a whole lot of interaction. And again, no matter what, you're always going to have all of the hunters, no matter how many characters or how many players you have. So you're always going to have that same sort of dynamic between the 2 sides. But either way, Fury of Dracula, really fun, great hidden movement, and very distinct character type game is my number 8. At number 7, I've got another game that unfortunately I do not own, but it's a very relatively simplistic travel game called Tokaido. In this particular game, you are essentially just traveling along a little path and you're making certain stops to like take pictures and buy souvenirs and all this kind of stuff, literally traveling through Japan. And it's not really childish, but it's fairly close. You have a relatively cartoonish feel to it, and you've got you do have an element of fairly deep strategy to it, and similarly to Tzolk'in, you've got sort of dummy characters that are playing as well, so that they can block off certain locations if you're only playing with 2 players. The unique thing about this, though, is that the dummy players are moved by whoever is out front, so that part switches off, and you can end up blocking your opponent in very strategic ways, which I really appreciate. I really enjoy with this particular game playing with only 2 players. And again, just like with some of the other ones, it tends to be more efficient with fewer players because it's just sort of back and forth, as opposed to having to wait a longer amount of time for it to get back to your turn. But either way, Tokaido, really fun game. I have not tried it with any of the expansions. I think there's only one at this point, but I've not tried it with that. I've only done it with the base game, but it's still a really great game, and I've had a lot of fun with only 2 players. And so Tokaido is my number 7. At number 6, I've got a game on this list that's actually fairly unique because it's the only one that's really a very distinctively cooperative game, and it happens to be my favorite cooperative game, which is Pandemic. Now, Pandemic, this is one that I always tout as something that has a wonderful theme. It's very easy for people to understand. Everybody's pretty much going to know what's going on, why it's going on, and what we're scared of and all this kind of stuff. I do have all the expansions as well, but just the base game really does work with 2 players, although I really like to have On the Brink at the very minimum. Now with any and every cooperative game, you can always just play with 2 players. You can even just play with 1 player. It's just a matter of playing multiple characters, and Pandemic is no different. And that's why for this list I wanted to have at least one really good classic cooperative game, simply because of that. That said, you could easily have pretty much every game on this list being a bunch of cooperative games because they all work the same way. But I chose Pandemic because it's simply my favorite cooperative game. It's very well designed, especially once you get the On the Brink expansion. You have a lot more options. You've got a lot of really interesting things you can do with the diseases and how you can sort of mix and match the different modules from the expansion and the different characters, the different events, all of that kind of stuff. So you get a lot more versatility with the game, and I just really enjoy it with 2 players. You can also play it with 2 players as both people playing as 2 characters, one person playing as 2 and the other playing as 1. Really doesn't matter. It's great to have that pretty heavy versatility in any game, really. But that's why overall Pandemic is my number 6. At number 5, I've got a relative newcomer to my collection that I have played many times and have absolutely fallen in love with, as has most of the board gaming community. The game itself is Terraforming Mars. In this particular game, you are doing exactly what the title says. You are trying to terraform Mars. You're trying to make it livable. And the way you do that is by adding in oceans and trees and warming up the temperature and putting oxygen into the atmosphere and all this kind of stuff. With the idea being that as you go, you're just playing a bunch of cards. Now, like pretty much everything on this list, you're not doing a whole lot of player-to-player direct interaction. There is some, but not so much that it gets ruined when you only have 2 or even solo play. The game, this game actually has a really wonderful solo mode that's a lot of fun and is actually designed and balanced very well. But with just 2 players, the competitive version of this game is actually very well done as well. And again, it really boils down to the fact that you don't have a lot of direct interaction with the other players. There is some, and there's things like you take away resources or like you destroy resources and things of that nature, but those types of cards are relatively few and far between. And especially with a 2-player game, it's a lot tighter, and so you need to make certain that you focus on building up your own engines, and you're focused on yourself rather than trying to slow down your opponent. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic compared with having more players. And just in that sense, I think it's really incredible, because I like it when a game feels different with different numbers of players. When it feels different in a good way, I should say, because there are plenty of games that feel different in bad ways with a differing number of players. But either way, Terraforming Mars is my number 5. At number 4, I've got another game that is mostly considered cooperative, but with some of the people that I play, they play it very competitively. The game is Forbidden Desert. Now, I was really debating between doing Forbidden Island, Forbidden Desert, because they're both great cooperative games that work very well with anywhere from, I think it's 2 to 5, if I'm not mistaken. Very quick to play, very fast to learn, all of that good stuff. I went with Forbidden Desert just because it has a little bit more strategic depth compared to Forbidden Island, which kind of makes sense because it came out afterwards and it's sort of like the spiritual successor type of thing. But again, it is another cooperative game, and the idea is that you are trying to work together, but at the same time, you do have sort of the winner at the end of the game. So you do have a bit of a competitive streak. And that's why this game is a little bit higher up on the list, because I like that fact where, like, always in the back of your mind, you're thinking like, okay, well, it's good if I help everybody, but it's better if I help myself. that kind of thing. And it's really, really fun in that sense. And we've got a very good, very tight design on this. I love the components, the little tiles and the little pieces. They're great. I mean, and I just really like the tin too. It's not something that I normally talk about, but the actual container for the game is really, really interesting and really fun. This is probably the fastest game to play on this entire list, unlike my list last week where pretty much everything was really, really fast. And so that's another reason why this is a little bit higher up on the list. But regardless, Forbidden Desert, my number 4. At number 3, I've got a game that is essentially a classic example of something that is great with 2 players, and I believe was actually released as a 2-player exclusive game at one point or another. The game itself is Lost Cities. I only have this version of the game, which is for 2 to 4 players. I've played with every number of players, and I absolutely love it. It's a really interesting archaeological type of thing where you're essentially just playing sequentially larger cards. That's really all it boils down to. So it's a little bit press your luck. It's a little bit similar to something like Battle Line or something along those lines, where you're just trying to find bigger and bigger and bigger cards. But as you get higher up, then there are fewer of those numbers in the deck. And the idea is simply being that you're trying to get as far along certain paths as you can. And so you've got card management, you've got pressing your luck, you've got relatively little interaction with the other players. Again, that's a theme throughout this entire list by and large. And it is so well balanced. It's such a cool theme. I mean, you're talking about like Indiana Jones and that kind of stuff, and so everybody's going to understand and respect the theme. And not only that, but this is a Cosmos game, and Cosmos being fairly famous for games that play well with two players, although this is not one of the 2-player Cosmos system games specifically. But either way, I really enjoy this game. It's another one that is very, very quick to learn. It takes a little bit longer to play, which is just, it makes a very nice balance between like setup time and play time, because you're talking about right about an hour or so to actually play through the game, but it's just so fast to learn. It's so simple, and it's just an incredibly well designed and very fun game. Lost Cities, my number 3. At number 2, I've got a game that was actually really a big surprise for me personally as I was coming up with this list, because I said I have to have this game. It's a wonderful game for 2 players, even though it's pretty heavily interactive. I absolutely have a blast with it every single time I play it, and it is Evolution. Evolution specifically, I'm talking about the base game, but you can also play it with Flight and or Climate, the expansions that are currently out, and it works reasonably well. I have not played like the Evolution, what is it called, like the Basics or something like that. I don't remember what the actual name of the game is, but there's like another re-release of Evolution. Either way, I'm talking about this, the base game. And I mentioned that there is a lot of interaction in this game, mostly in the form of the carnivores. You can have your carnivore and you're essentially eating your opponents. You can also eat your own species as well. And on top of that, you also have everybody contributing to the watering hole every turn and all of that kind of thing. The reason that I still wanted this on this list is because of how well the game balances with pretty much any number of players. You can literally play this game with like 9, 10, 12 people, because you just have so many cards, right? Once you get all the expansions and stuff, you just have so many cards that it can actually work. It's difficult and it can be frustrating, but it can work. With only 2 players, again, everything just scales so beautifully in this game that the interaction and everything still works very, very well between the 2 people. And on top of that, you essentially get a lesson in biology and how it works. For example, if your opponent keeps having their carnivore eat all of your species, then what are you going to do about it? Well, let's make my guys bigger. now you can't eat them anymore. You know, that is the idea, or one of the ideas behind evolution by natural selection, is that you have advantageous traits that can no longer be taken advantage of by the other characters or the other players. On top of that, you have things like being able to climb, and so you can hide, and they can't eat you then, and all that kind of thing. So it's really incredibly well balanced and scales so beautifully with any number of players. And I've played this with up to, I think 9 was the highest that I've played it with, and it wasn't smooth, but once we really got into it, it worked well. It still was a playable game. It just took a little while to really get into it. But again, like a handful of others on this list, this is a really simple game, very quick to learn, very easy to play. And I actually did a review and gameplay demo on this if you'd like to see it, so you can take a look and really go in depth for how to play. But like I said, the biggest thing for me is the fact that it scales so beautifully with the interaction amongst the players. I absolutely love it. I love the science behind it. I love everything about the game. Evolution is my number 2. At number 1, I've actually got another game that I unfortunately do not own, but was finally able to recently play, and that is Tiny Epic Galaxies. Now, I have not played any of the other ones like Tiny Epic Western or Tiny Epic Kingdoms or anything like that. I have only played Tiny Epic Galaxies, and I've played it with different numbers of players, and I have to say I loved it with 2 people. Like several of the other games on this list, and most of the games on my list last week, this is a small, compact, easy to learn, easy to play, fast to play game that has a shockingly deep strategy. Seriously, there are so many strategic decisions that you have to make with the Tiny Epic series that it's absolutely incredible. In the case of Tiny Epic Galaxies, you're rolling dice to try to get certain symbols so that you can do different things. Relatively similar to Roll for the Galaxy in the sense of you're just trying to be able to perform actions in some way, shape, or form, and in the end, the idea is that you're trying to build up your empire so that you can get more dice and become more efficient, get more ships and all this kind of stuff. Everybody has a secret goal that they're trying to achieve. You're always trying to become more diplomatic and all that kind of stuff. And that's one of the things I really love about the game, is it boils down a lot of interactivity into the cards and the dice and all that kind of stuff. And almost like a war game, but a very, very, very superficial war game. So again, you're talking about, you have things like economic prowess and you have diplomacy, but it's just like a symbol on a die. It's not something that's really, really in-depth, but I just had such a blast with this game. I had so much fun, and it's just this tiny little box. Like, it's very compact, tremendously fun, honestly, shockingly strategic. So many decisions to make, whether you're going to be doing conversions and all this kind of stuff. Tiny Epic Galaxies, by and far, is my number 1. Well, everybody, that's going to be it for me. I hope that you enjoyed this 3rd installment of my mini-series on 2-player gaming. In this case, talking about my top 10 favorite games for 2 players that have a versatile number of players you can do it with. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is an enormous category. This is probably the biggest category, or one of the biggest that I've ever done, because we're simply talking about games that you can play with 2 people. And that is a fairly large portion of games. And the question is, how well does it work with only 2 players? Again, it's kind of weird with 2 because you've got less interactivity, you've got less in terms of options for who you can attack and how you can attack. You've got fewer options in terms of doing auctions and stuff of that nature. So for example, I love Power Grid. Power Grid's a great game. I played it with 2 players and it's reasonably fun, but it's not great. Same thing with something like Race for the Galaxy. You really really need to have more players so that you can have those multiple phases, even though with Race for the Galaxy specifically, if you play with 2 players, both players are playing 2 cards simultaneously rather than just 1. And same thing with something like Citadels. You can play that with 2 players. But social deduction with only 2 people, it just feels wrong. It just feels weird. And so, as always, I am very, very curious what you guys have to say about this. What do you guys like about this category? What do you not like? What are some of your favorite games that you enjoy playing with 2 players that are designed for multiple numbers of players? You guys know I would love to hear from you. I always love hearing your discussions. But with that, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you enjoyed my little mini-series on 2-player games in general. But with that, thank you so very much again for watching, and I will see you next time.